Good morning.
Good morning.
I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Pilar Aguilar, who is the director of an organization called FUHD. It's a foundation that focuses on human rights and public policies. Pilar, you will explain what that is later. She's also an international education expert. Pilar has a PhD in education from the University of Hull in the UK. She has been working in the area of humanitarian education since 1986, in charge of teacher training project for Salvadorian refugees in Belize. When she worked for the Central American University Confederation, CSUCA, in San Jose, Costa Rica. In 1989, she worked for the World University Service International in Geneva, evaluating projects for Latin America, and worked as an education and emergency specialist advisor since 1992. So she has a whole lot of experience behind her. She has worked all over the world in practically every continent. She's worked in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, the Caribbean, South Asia, Europe, and the US for UNICEF and other organizations, including other UN agencies that deal with refugees like UNRWA, both as a consultant and later as an international education specialist in humanitarian disaster situations, both in natural disasters and armed conflict. From 1994 to 1997, she was the chief of education at UNICEF Rwanda, where she was responsible for the creation of the first rapid back-to-school initiative. And this initiative benefited roughly 800,000 children that included refugees and displaced persons. Her greatest contribution has been in the area of rapid response in complex emergencies, which has been highly motivated to realize the right to education of children, teachers who have been victims of natural disasters and armed conflicts. She has published extensively in journals, books, and other publications. Today, she will be sharing her experiences and insights on the implications and response to the humanitarian crisis in Latin America, this unprecedented crisis in Latin America arising from the mass cross-border migrations from Venezuela to Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Brazil, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and even as far away as USA through Mexico. And my name is Sheila Wamahiu. I'm from Jaslika, and I shall be facilitating this interview. So, Pilar, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for making time for this interview. I would like to start with asking you, maybe first of all, to just explain what your foundation is. FHUD, what does it stand for?
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here among you. FUHD, or Fondation Henri Dunant, it's all it means. It's a foundation that, as you already mentioned, dedicates its efforts mostly to public policies and human rights. We provide diplomas to people, professionals already from Latin America, but also from Chile. It is based in Santiago, and I'm outposted here in Geneva, as usual. It's a story of my life. But in the times of COVID, probably that is not so unusual anymore. And it's even a something that is going to become more and more the norm rather than the exception. Anyway, we are a team of directors, and there is a president, and they are all in Chile. I'm the only one that I'm here outside in Switzerland. But happy to be with that team also and work with them.
Thank you so much, Pilar. So to start with the focus of this interview, I'd like to start by highlighting some of the statistics, because from my reading of the crisis in Venezuela, it shows that there's an unprecedented crisis. According to official statistics, there are at least 5 million Venezuelans who have fled the country. And this has never happened in Latin America before. And globally, this crisis is second only to that in Syria. We hear a lot about Syria in this part of the world where we are, which is Nairobi. We maybe don't hear as much about what is happening in Latin America. So maybe you could help us to understand this phenomenon and tell us very briefly what has led to the situation. Because Venezuela used to be a very, very rich country. So what has happened suddenly?
Thank you, Sheila, for giving me the opportunity to share with you some of my experience, my recent experience, having been in the area and having worked with people that are taking care of this massive and, as you mentioned, unprecedented migration. This, yes, never happened before. And it started basically, to make it brief and short, in 2015. 2015, people started to immigrate to different parts of Latin America, what is called basically today south migration. There's north, south, there's south, north, etc. This is a south migration. Everybody used to go to the States before, but now they are coming actually to other countries in Latin America. And this started because of, under Obama's administration, the first set of sanctions to Venezuela were imposed. And why did this happen is because it was Venezuela was, according to Obama, was a threat to its national security. These sanctions have been increasingly become more and more aggressive. Now, with Trump's administration, to a country that is an oil-rich, or was an oil-rich country, actually people started to obviously feel and resent all this crisis. And in 2017, actually, with Trump's administration, all sanctions started to be more and more hard. And in 2019, the straw was to actually apply an oil embargo to Venezuela. So you can just imagine how people started to feel, because this is under Maduro, which is the current president of, disputed though, but the current president of Venezuela. it's been very hard. Venezuelan society is not by no means similar to what it used to be during a few decades ago. So President, as I said, Donald Trump imposed this oil embargo under pressure also, and this puts an extra pressure to the already a state that has weakened tremendously, a state that was reached, had no problems for access to education, healthcare, etc., etc. I mean, everybody wanted to go to Venezuela. As if you were a migrant or even a refugee, you wanted to go to Venezuela. Venezuela was a very a pole of attraction for migrants and for refugee populations. But the situation is now that because of corruption and human rights abuses and all of this, there's been a very hard situation. And together with the sanctions, the migration started to increase. And today is increasing, it's never been decreasing. And this is what is unprecedented. Also, I would like to say that what have been the consequences of all of this into the education sector, a country that had never had any problems with access, on the contrary. But for the first time, we have 4.8 million people that between 2015 and today have left Venezuela. You can just imagine what that means. Out of those 4.8 Venezuelans that are distributed all over the world, 3.9 million are in Latin America and the Caribbean. And out of this, we have 1.2 million children that are in need of assistance. So together, parallel to the sanctions, the migration started to increase also. And today, because sanctions have not stopped and have not been lifted, it continues. Worldwide, we have 272 million migrants today, according to the International Office for Migration, Organization for Migration, IOM. And today we have a humanitarian corridor between Venezuela and Colombia. Colombia is the neighboring country, and historically they have been very close countries. The Venezuelans, they have a problem, they go to Colombia. Colombians, basically for the last 50 years, as you know, they have had violence and war, internal wars, etc., and guerrillas. They have many of them have thousands, I would say, that have migrated to Venezuela because they offered better standards of living. Today is the contrary. And Colombia today hosts, if you ask me, at least 1.8 million Venezuelans. And because of the pandemic, they have created today a corridor, what is called a humanitarian corridor between Venezuela and Colombia, and where there are 7 official crossings. Where before the pandemic, 40 40 to 50,000 people used to cross daily. Today, if 200 cross those borders is too much. Many Venezuelans would like to go back to their country as well. Not in large numbers, but some do and would like to go back. So those, in a nutshell, are very broadly the consequences of these sanctions and why this large-scale migration is so unprecedented. And obviously, countries were not prepared to receive the people, migrants, in this, even with the best will of the world, at this scale.
Thank you so much for that snapshot of both the genesis of this crisis and the situation, and the statistics that really tell us the enormity of the problem. It is what has happened in Venezuela just reinforce the fact that it is very easy to destroy, but more difficult to build. Because Venezuela was a country that was thriving. It had all the basic facilities for its citizens, but today it's in shambles. So that is really very sad. As you were talking, you've used several different terms. You've talked about migration. And to my mind, when we talk about migration, it is, people moving voluntarily from one place to the other. You've also talked about refugees and IDP. So how is this migration, first of all, different from the normal migration that we think about? And what's the difference between migrations and refugees, migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons? Because we hear about all this in the media. So how would you differentiate between these terms?
Yeah, many people have dedicated, but they have never come to an agreement exactly what does it mean a migrant and how different it is from a refugee. Internally displaced people is different because they move within the borders of their country. However, a migrant is any person who changes his or her country of usual residence. In a nutshell, that's what a migrant is. And they cross international borders, but then they are not afraid of persecution, theoretically. That's the difference with a refugee. A refugee flees the country because they are away from. They want to be away from war. They want to escape from war. They are going to be. They have fear of persecution, and that is the essence of a refugee, according to international law.
Okay, so what you're saying, just to be clear, you're saying a refugee is one who flees the country. They're not fleeing it voluntarily. They're leaving the country because they fear persecution. They fear real harm, physical and other types of harm to themselves. And this could be because of political situation, armed conflict, for example.
Yes.
Or even you could also have it for natural disaster. You can still become a refugee in another country.
Yes, but that's more like this. Yes, you may.
Armed conflict.
Refugees is more when you escape from armed conflicts.
Okay.
Generalized violence. And also you have crossed an international border and you have status. You have a refugee status, which allows you to integrate into other societies or communities.
But in the case of migrants, in the case of what's happening in Venezuela,
Yes.
then from what you have said, we can conclude that they're not fleeing because of armed conflict. They're not fleeing because of fear of persecution, but they are leaving their country because of maybe economic reasons.
Because of migrants mostly would like to go to other countries to find a better standard of living. And they usually send remittances to their own countries, to their own family, and countries like El Salvador in Central America lived on remittances. The spinal cord of their economy, it's been actually remittances.
But in the
Migrants, in that sense, have contributed to global economy. Now,
yes, in the case of Venezuela,
well,
what's happening?
I would like to, because that's more the migrant notion we have in mind. But in the case of Venezuela, in this case, we could argue that it's forced migration. It is polemic. However, in many articles I have read and I have talked to people and specialists in international laws and migration laws, because people are not living because they may not feel persecuted as such, but they have no ways to survive in their own society. And that, as a society that is not able to offer their citizens, their people, security, they don't feel secure in their country. So when we talk about this, we have to see a very fine line here between a refugee and migrant in the Venezuelan case. We can talk also about forced migration. And within migration, there are subcategories. Forced migration is one of them, or mixed flows of migrants, meaning that you have also people that are returnees. You have people that they are called pendular migrants, meaning that they go back and forth on a daily basis from Venezuela to Colombia, just to buy medicine or even education. They cross the border every single day. And this could be children, could be adults, could be young, elderly, any type of population. You see, it's not a homogeneous situation or population or situation in terms of migration. It is complex, like as we used to talk about complex emergencies. This is a complex migration. For the first time, I found myself in a situation where it was more important for a child a document than anything else, than even eating. Because if the child or the parents and the family didn't have those documents, they were nobody. They were totally invisible. And that is what today I think there is an effort of the international community, national ministries, etc., governments, to make this migration something more easier for people to integrate into society. A migrant is a resource person that is going to contribute, obviously, to that society. Look at the United States. It's a melting pot. Look at Chile, my own country, another melting pot of people. My father was a Spaniard. I'm a child of migrants also. So I have been basically a refugee myself. In 1973, I had to flee my country. This is why I'm so keen, if you like, in all of these issues. And they have been part of my life, and this is what I have devoted my effort and my energy to, for especially for the children that migrate. I had at some point, obviously, all of these issues have to face to integrate, and there was no United Nations of High Commissioner for Refugees at that time, 1973, 1974, mid-1970s. It's only afterwards that it's all started. So there is today, we have progressed in that situation, along those lines. Now, you talked also about internally displaced peoples, which are persons or groups, but they are forced to be moved as well, because there is an internal conflict, like the Colombian conflict also, or in Afghanistan you have displaced populations, or Pakistan, or you know it very well, Bangladesh, etc., etc. And they are forced to leave their usual place, their habitat, their place of residence. But then they don't cross international borders many times. That's not the usual thing about internally displaced. That's why they're called internally displaced populations. So this is what I want to say, that there is not a clear cut between one person. I put myself in the spot because I was a migrant, and I was a refugee, and I've been a migrant as well. So you see, it is very, very, very complex. Mm-hmm. All you want sometimes is to survive, and if you can, to continue your studies, for instance, if they have been interrupted. But on the other hand, you have a world to learn in other societies and other cultures.
Thank you for that clarification. You're absolutely right when you say the line between migrants, refugees, IDPs can sometimes be very blurred, because you might think you're an IDP, for example, in one country, but then something happens to the country, like it happened in the South Asian subcontinent, where IDPs, let's say in what is now Bangladesh, in Pakistan became refugees almost, because the country split into Bangladesh and Pakistan. So because of political reasons and political definitions, the status of migrants and refugees and IDPs can change. And I think in the case of the forced migration, one of the issues that you had mentioned, as when we talked before this interview, you talked about the whole issue of them being undocumented in many cases. And even you just mentioned that they may have no papers. So they become undocumented, and unlike refugees who may have documentation and they have a certain status, many of these forced people suffering from forced migration don't have. And we've seen that in the US, what's happening, the undocumented migrants in the US. So, but that's, I think, a topic for another day. Let's move on with this back to Venezuela. Maybe you could just tell us, you've talked about this massive movement of people, almost 5 million, 4.8, according to the official statistics. There could be more. And what is the demographic profile of these migrants? Who are they? What's their gender? What's their age? Are they the same ethnicity? Are they homogeneous? Just explain that to us a little bit.
Well, homogeneous they are not. And they are basically people are Venezuelans, and there within the Venezuelans there are indigenous communities also that flee the country. In terms of gender, overall there is gender parity. I mean, there is no much difference between women and men. Although you have many children, as I said, 1.2 million. 1.2 million, are in need of those of assistance today. But I have talked a lot about Colombia, but they have also gone to other countries like Ecuador, which is towards the southern part, Peru, Brazil, and as you mentioned, Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago. These are the 7 countries where mostly they have the most number of migrants have been trying to.
So how have they been received in these countries?
They have what I was going to just to finish the idea is that 30% of, I mean, among these countries, 25% are children and adolescents of all of those that immigrate among this, which is a large number of children and adolescents. That's why so much it's the if you like the demand for access to education, healthcare, and other basics social services. Sorry, you were saying.
No, I was asking, you've just mentioned that it's like a third.
Yes, like a third.
Are children and adolescents.
That's,
and you also mentioned that they're in great need of social services. So my question was, how have the host countries received them?
the host countries have been actually, and this has been interesting, there has been an open door policy and welcoming, if you like, of this of the Venezuelan community. You must understand that also in Latin America there are lots of other immigrants and migrant people, and so, but never in this quantities, if you like, in these numbers. But people in the communities, people in society have actually received them as I wouldn't say they have been to a certain extent generous, and governments have done everything possible to keep them as migrants, and that's why probably there is this a little bit of confusion in terms of migrants and refugees, is because they want to keep them as migrants rather than refugees, and to welcome them and offer them all access to education, health, and and nutrition, etc., etc. So the problem is that in the education sector, they were already overstretched. Countries like Peru, for instance, they were absolutely no problem to bring people, but they don't have the slots at the schools because of administrative issues, because of political issues, because of they were completely overstretched in terms of not having enough teachers for the non-Venezuelan children. To go just to the idea of being the nationals, these are Peruvians, these are Haitians, or these are from Dominican Republic, they are children. And the more we reinforce the idea, I prefer to talk about, in this case, because to explain Venezuelan and non-Venezuelan children. Because also it's not homogeneous in any country. Ecuador and Peru are countries with large indigenous communities. So people are coming also from the mountains, from everywhere, and inland indigenous communities, they are already used to them. And they speak different languages. Don't believe that in Latin America, all you do is to just speak Spanish. You also speak many other languages. They are indigenous languages. Guatemala alone has like 240 dialects and languages. Peru, Aymara, Quechua, Bolivia, etc., all countries, Ecuador. And so among the Venezuelans, I would say that there is this specific, I'm going to refer to a specific ethnic group, quite vulnerable, called Warao, which is WARAO, the Warao community. The Warao community has double or triple injury, if you like. They are vulnerable. They are migrants, and especially girls they have also, they don't speak Spanish, most of them, or not well. They are illiterate, and they immigrate also because of, also they have problems because of violence and the scarce resources they have. If Venezuelans at large, because they are also Venezuelans, but they belong to this ethnic group. So they immigrated to Brazil, and which shares the border also as Colombia shares the border with Venezuela. And they have been actually allocated in places, in different places. They want to, it's not only because of discrimination, they want to be together also as ethnic group, which makes sense because something we have to protect in indigenous communities is their identity. And their identity in terms of language. So learning, in this case, Portuguese for them is an asset. You can see it as a hindrance, but I think it's also an asset to learn another skill, another language, in this case. So they have actually tried to, especially the local communities, because Brazil is a country with such large, also indigenous communities, they are very sensitive to these minority ethnic groups.
So thank you. We can see the kind of complexity because of the diversity of the migrants and because of the different systems that also exist in the different countries where the migrants are going to, the place they're migrating to. Maybe you have touched upon it already, the issue of services for children, and especially what does it mean for the right to education? You've given this kind of complexity. Maybe you could just outline that for us. What does it really mean for them?
With all this situation, children, there are many issues. First of all, is capacity. Limited capacity of all of these countries to accommodate these large numbers of children. I have to, and that is across the board. In all countries, it's the same issue. All surveys actually will actually confirm what I'm saying. I would say that I would like to probably say that apart from the barriers or language barrier, that you could see it as a barrier, as I said before, but also you can see it as an asset that they have to learn. It's just during the transitional period where the child has to accommodate, integrate into a new community. Adults, the same thing. And these children most of them are, as you said, undocumented. These non-documented children have a big issue because for the right to fulfill the right to education to children is not just to provide them with access to education, as we all know. We have to provide them quality education. We have to provide them with all the, in this case of migration, the legal aspects are very important. For refugees as well. But there is something that I would like to refer to, which is being overlooked for many, many years everywhere, which is the issue of accreditation, validation, and also you have children that haven't been, the certification, validation, and accreditation. Though if you don't have those, the child has the right to education has not been fulfilled. Pure and simple. And this has happened since I have started my career, and I have been when I have been in Africa or in Middle East or in many other. This issue of accreditation, validation, or recognitions of studies from other countries has never been addressed properly. In Latin America, in all the countries that there are like 22 that speak Spanish, there is only one agreement at regional level, one agreement, that the national agreement that is being designed, unfortunately not for migrant children or refugees or displaced populations. It's been designed for documented children. So in this case, little use. So that what will happen is that with all of this pressure, today they're reviewing this international agreement. But it will take time. So what have actually ministries of education and ministers of education do in this case? They have issued, and this is the goodwill, if you like, of hosting migrant communities, is that they have actually have new degree, especially tailored for migrants, not only Venezuelan, for migrants at large. But if it is Venezuelans, they've also have done all these agreements at national and local levels within their countries. Now, this has to now go into an intra-regional level. And the ministers, there was a minister of education symposium or conference where they talked about these issues. And the Guatemalan minister, they brought also people from Central America, participated in this event. He said something that also today it's so important and crucial. People are here to stay. They are not going to go. And that is the new situation. That is for Latin America a new situation where, because they obviously under these circumstances, they are not, very few will go back to Venezuela, or they have integrated into the new societies and they will stay. As did, my father did. Never went back.
And I think that's a very, very important point that you're making, that people are here to stay, they're not going to go back. And we've seen that happen, not now in the South American context, but we've seen that happen in even East Africa, where I am, where you've had Somali refugees, Sudanese refugees who have come, stayed. We thought they'll go away. They did not, and they're still here. Many, many of them are still here. They have not gone away because they've been born in the camps. So I think it's a very, very important recognition that that people are not necessarily going to go back. And even if they do, they might stay here long. And I think that has a policy implication.
Of course.
To provide services.
To provide services. And there is a good example. Well, yeah, you mentioned Africa. Everywhere, absolutely. And in Rwanda, where I was also, there are many that went to Tanzania, to Uganda. They have stayed there. Anyway, what probably I'm jumping a bit, but I think it is important that not only we have to see, what I'm trying to do is not to see only the negative aspect of being uprooted, also see the positive aspect of being uprooted. Positive aspects are learning new skills, integrating into new cultures. Maybe, and in this sense, because there are problems of discrimination, intolerance, xenophobia, and racism, as you know, bullying, all the rest of it, all that exists, all those aspects.
What about, you've mentioned all these challenges, discrimination, xenophobia, bullying, and so on. What about gender-based violence? Do you see that to be a challenge, a significant challenge among the refugees, amongst the migrants? Sorry.
There are issues, obviously, but what I would say it's more. I'm more familiarized with what's happened at the classroom level, if you like, which is a reflection of what is happening many times in home. I would say that obviously this is something. When I was talking to in Peru to one of head principal, she mentioned yes, I have to admit that some children refer to them and they do this naming things and because parents and they talk at home, they also reflect that discrimination in the classroom, and we have to teach our teachers. We have to provide our teachers with the guidelines to how to cope in these cases with this kind of situation. There are also traumatized children. Obviously, there is domestic violence as well. In all of this, there is tension, and children are a sponge, as you know. They received tension, and where do they go? They go to school, and they try to, if they can go to school. Some of them are out of school, and that is also a problem. However, I think in terms of providing and reinforcing teachers to cope with the situation, there have been awareness campaigns in Panama, in Colombia, everywhere to actually in terms of xenophobia and bullying, especially bullying. Bullying is a huge issue, and a bit across the board.
So you're talking about labeling of children, stigmatizing the children, even in the school situation.
Right.
But also what happens outside the school, of course, also has a bearing on the child,
Exactly.
whether the child is in school or out of school. And you've talked about domestic violence.
Yeah.
Now, I'm just wondering, there's now this pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and I know it may be too early to talk about some of the consequences, but you did mention earlier in the interview that there used to be a huge number of thousands of people migrating every day, crossing the borders every day into Colombia, into other countries. But now, since the COVID, there's barely 200 people who are migrating back and forth. So that already is, I don't know whether it's a good sign or a bad sign that they're not migrating. Maybe you can clarify that a little bit. But also, how does that pose a challenge to education if there have been some kind of reports that talk about to this problem? And if there isn't, that's fine. We can talk about it some other time.
Well, in the case of COVID and the pandemic, obviously, the strategies that you used to do are not any longer in place. People cannot go to school. They are in quarantine or lockdown, etc., etc. Or families simply don't want them to be exposed. And that is also something that we need to review. And it's a challenge for all educators at this moment to actually go online. Not everybody has access also to online facilities. And that happens not only in Latin America, I think is all over. Today, there is an estimation of 1.2 billion children outside that are not receiving education at the moment, as we speak. That is something that is difficult. And what I wanted to say is that some families, some Venezuelans, are trying to go back because that is the initial sentiment you have, to go back to your nucleus, to your family, to your own, to your country where you are well known, and especially in a pandemic where you are probably not going to see your grandmother or grandparents anymore, or children that stay back, your own children stay back in Venezuela. Not all of them. And I would say that it's because of COVID, and it's been, there is a war in the, if you like, in the borders today, that because people would like to go, and in a way it's natural that these things happen. However, there is a danger, and we have today this invisible enemy, that is so difficult to explain, and so difficult to actually address the problem in many ways. So at the moment, yes, I can understand that the authorities at the border have been strict to the limit. But some say, well, it's only political, they don't want to leave us. But obviously, who knows, they may have been exposed, and many have been exposed. And we don't know, this is also an unprecedented issue, virus. The coronavirus is, we haven't had something like this in our lifetime, at least. So yeah, it is a complex issue at the moment with COVID. Obviously, it's going to reinforce in many countries. In my country, in Chile, domestic violence went up 45% since the lockdown. All of us shut up.
That is definitely a topic for another day. Yeah. Where we need to discuss it further, the impact of COVID on different types of violence, and the safety and security of children and women. But before we leave this issue of challenges, there's one more question that I'd like to ask you. In terms of, you did refer to the issues of lack of certification, validation, and accreditation. But my question to you is, what was the standard of education, the quality of education in Venezuela prior to this crisis, and the quality, the level, the standards in Venezuela, are they the same in the other countries? Or is it that the children, those who have been to school in Venezuela, they've had to lower the standards in other countries? It's,
Yeah, well, it is, thanks for the question, because it's very important in terms of today children. Venezuelan system was one of the best systems of education. They have access to education until for many decades. And it was there was no problem in terms of economic problems, or it was a very good standard for Venezuelans. Venezuelans, when they go to another country, and I know there are statistics on that, they usually are better prepared or have better standards of education than the non-Venezuelans. And I have what I'm thinking is the case of in Chile also. When they arrived, they had this, but they didn't have a way sometimes to prove it or to be documented. And the processes for documentation, validation, accreditation is so slow and so full of hindrances. It's like the system is working against you, not for you. Never in your favor. You're always against the tide in this case. And there is always a stamp or a seal or something that is missing. So that is, but that doesn't mean that the Venezuelan children are less educated. Maybe in the last 5 years or 7 years, if you like, of course, because of sanctions and so on and so forth, the educational system has gone down completely, and almost to the brink of schools being closed down, because there are no way how to maintain the power cuts, etc., etc., etc. Teachers' salaries. A teacher earns something the equivalent to $7 to $8. So you can just imagine. The inflation is 2,000%. ATMs are not working, meaning that the cash flow is minimal and difficult. So those that, of course, that have access to international salaries, or yes, of course, no problem. However, for people that were used to have a very high standard of living, all of a sudden went down to queuing up for buying a piece of bread. So it is difficult. It is very difficult and very complex today. And this is something which is sad also to see for all of us that had witnessed all of this deterioration along the way. Even when our former president, Michelle Bachelet, visited Venezuela, she recognized obviously that there is a problem and a crisis in the country, and the government has not addressed the issues of probably that they should have addressed in terms of human rights, because she now is as you know, she's heading the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. But she says sanctions, she refers to sanctions as well. And according to them, they have paid a toll. So there is also a lot of self-esteem, if you like, among Venezuelans that have gone down. And believe me, I have seen people manicurists everywhere in Latin America, that they were professionals. They were high level professionals. Biochemists were painting nails.
That's very, very sad when
something that's phase of migration right there. This particular migration I'm talking about.
Yeah, that is really sad to go from a country that provided all basic services for the citizens and for the children, including education, and had high standards for education, to now, just dropping. And there seems to be no end in sight yet. So maybe on that point, we can move on to the questions on the responses, country and education responses, regional responses. You did mention earlier that at the country level, they have been reviewing. They've had an agreement and they reviewed some of these. Is it the accreditation process?
Yeah,
at the country level? Yeah, maybe you could expound on that.
Yeah. Well, I would say that while I was in Panama, the end of 2018 and early 2019, the regional office, in this case, the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, I was consulting to them. They, together with other national and international NGOs also, and other and UNESCO, they try to come together and actually see how could we accelerate the process of changing and modifying this international agreement. So there were quite a few the people. I talked personally to some education directors of the Ministry of Education, etc. They were all willing. Everybody was willing to modify it. But as you know, there are established processes many times that are difficult to accelerate. The people at the ministry level, they hardly see the sense of urgency, as you well know. And it's very difficult to infuse a sense of urgency all of a sudden and say, well, why don't you do it? You see easy ways out, if you like, easy ways how to accelerate certain processes that are hindering, obviously, the right to education. Simple, but it's not possible to go against. They have the right to say no. We would like to do this in this and this manner. So that's why there are many provisional decrees and directives and guidelines that have been produced, if you like, inverted commas, ad hoc manner, but just to protect children, actually. So those people that see the situation more closely, like school directors, etc., teachers, etc., they come up with solutions immediately. They come up immediately with solutions for these children. Whereas at other levels, at higher levels, it's much more difficult. and complex. So I'm not blaming anybody. The situation is as it is. However, as I said, in a situation of migration like the one we are seeing, that sense of urgency is not there. So it's difficult to apply methodologies that were done and designed for specifically for complex emergencies or for emergency or rapid educational responses. So that's in a way something that we need to win. It's a new situation. And for me, it was a new situation, adding all of this other dimension of complexity, documentation, legal, normatives, etc., etc., etc. I mean, you need to have all of that in place.
What would you say? We do understand the complexity and the bureaucracy. You know, bureaucracies are slow to change. We know that. In some places more than others, but it's a system that changing the mindset and the structures that's involved. But even within that, which country would you say had the best response? Are there any countries you can name?
Actually, I would say, I would like to respond to that by saying that the only country that actually has not complied with the Convention of the Rights of the Child has been Trinidad and Tobago. And I'm really sorry for all the people I know from there. But I actually have to say that the authorities in that country, unless the children are documented, fully documented and registered, they have no access to education. But as you know, there is always a silver lining, and in all crises. The good thing is that because of that, probably Trinidad and Tobago is more prepared for COVID than probably any other country. They had actually looked into the possibility of providing non-formal education for migrants through online programs. So that it may well be a good thing.
So that's interesting.
End up learning from them.
So what you're saying is, in Trinidad and Tobago, the children who are not documented could not access schools.
Yes.
So, and I'm assuming many of the children were not documented.
Most of them, majority of them.
Most of majority.
You understand that Trinidad and Tobago is 7 miles away from Venezuela, meaning that it's a boat trip.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw many videos of people getting in through the beach because they went on a boat, and they just coming in undocumented, and some were caught, some others just managed to integrate or to go into other communities.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
Very, I mean, it's a situation.
So no, go ahead.
Whereas the other countries, they all have, I have to mention that Colombia has two very interesting educational methodologies and programs that they have been there for many, many years. One is Escuela Nueva, or New.
Yes.
Very well known. I think it's 30-year-old or 30 plus year old.
It's a good practice, internationally known good practice. Yeah.
That is very important. But also return to happiness. Return to happiness, or retorno a la alegría, happiness, is something that is used as for psychosocial support. And for children, for children going back to school in terms of reinforcing self-confidence through play and raising team and so on and so forth. Those are very good, but also Ecuador and Chile and everybody else has a program also. I'm just underlining these two that have been widely used also. But what I would like to point out is that there is no lack of creativity. There is plenty of creativity, and there is plenty there where you can learn from. And this is something that today there is an opportunity for all education program officers in the region to become acquainted with all of these programs. And this is what actually at the regional level, the offices, organizations have been doing, trying to bring them together and everybody together and disseminate all these good practices. If you would like me to end up this discussion, which is very important, and I know I'm taking probably a little bit of time. However,
no, just go ahead.
Of Peru, it's very interesting. In order to increase the access to education for children, where they had very little capacity, there was a national effort to apply a second shift. That's something that many people are also very familiar in the schools. So they increased their capacity in 10,000 slots immediately. But they didn't do it only for Venezuelans. And this is the good thing that they did. They did it across the board. Also for their own out-of-school children. And here is where I would like to underline, this is so important. If there is an opportunity today, is to actually provide education and access to school to all children, finally. All children, no matter what. Venezuelan, non-Venezuelans, migrant, non-migrants, refugees, they're children first and foremost. And this is, the campaign was called Lima, which is the Peruvian capital. Lima learns, not a child without studying. That's so beautiful.
Lima learns, not a child without study. Is that it?
Exactly. Lima learns, not a child without studying.
Without studying.
And this was launched by the Education Ministry. The whole campaign. So, and they said, we will have to re-examine all our registration practices. So, yes, there is migration, they're overstretched, etc. But there is the will, because this is political will in the end that we are talking about. And that's what makes the difference.
I think that is that's very powerful, because with political will, one can address the challenges that one has in a country. Like in this respect the right of all children to education, and using this crisis as an opportunity to expand services for everybody, regardless of who you are. As you've said, a child is a child. And so maybe I'd like you to finally give us, you have talked about your role a little bit, that you were there as, of course, you are from that region, that's number one. So you do understand many of the issues, and you have been working on these issues of emergency education and emergencies and humanitarian crisis for many, many years. So you have gone as a professional with all those knowledge and skills and experience. Do you want to add anything to that in terms of your own role in this crisis, the migrants crisis?
Yes, of course. This is one of every assignment is actually a challenge, but this one had this additional aspect, as I've mentioned, that I was addressing in such depth for the first time. What I did, my role, or what my assignment consisted of, developing a regional strategy for education, for migrations, for Venezuelans. I tried to add also for non-Venezuelans. I know this from my own experience from Syria, from Syrian refugees in Turkey. So I think the strategy to develop this strategy and as a roadmap, if you like, for the regional office, in this case for the UNICEF office. However, UNICEF doesn't work alone. They work actually with many other partners, and this is very important. And they obviously, it's becoming probably UNICEF is becoming like a broker, if you like, in terms of funding and for all in the education sector. So this strategy was for the education specialist, but also for people that would like to apply to have a framework for action, if you like. Apart from that, from this strategy of at a regional level that is based on what actually it was done, it took stock exactly of all countries, and it was interesting to see and to see that all of them had applied a rapid educational response as an initial response. But now they needed the continuity of that. They needed the mid-term to longer term. So that's what the strategy adds to that. But also, as a companion to this strategy, I developed guidelines for certification, accreditation, validation, certification, accreditation, and validation. Sorry. This obviously, for me, was a practical guideline, just a tool, just to say step by step what to do in these situations and what the child has the right to do. If they don't have that, I mean, if you don't provide this tool, it's very easy to get lost also in in aspects, so that also specialists at ministry level also can see where are the gaps, where can they reinforce, what are other countries doing. I put other examples of many other countries also. So those guidelines are a complement. Plus, I developed country profiles for the 7 countries, as I mentioned. Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, Peru, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, and Brazil. I visited 4 of them.
Yeah.
These are additional, if you like, and practical documents that actually they stand alone, but they can also be complementary.
And
Plus, as a last thing, is actually I'm a strong believer of networking. We actually established a network of all focal points for education. And that was very valuable because it was a weekly, if you like, and developed terms of reference for this, and it continues. And I think this is something that we can do, and probably today is very interesting because of the pandemic, and we need to maximize all those tools and to be together, because there were instances where I needed their decisions.
To me, that looks also like an opportunity to, all these tools that you developed can also be an opportunity to monitor, to audit what exists and what does not exist, and whether they're moving forward or they are where they were or moving backward, isn't it? From the way you've described the tools.
Exactly. The strategy is already, UNICEF had a regional strategies, obviously, overall strategy for the response. But you have to be based on that. I mean, you actually elaborate at in your specific sector, be it education, child protection, be it health.
Okay, I think we are almost running out of time now. What I would like you to do is give us your closing statement, your final words.
My final words. I would like people to see that this actually humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportions, there is a positive aspect at the end of the day to move on the Agenda 2030, meaning the Sustainable Development Goals, especially Goal 4, but also 10.7 and many others. Which is 10.7, I think, is migration. I would like to say that it is an opportunity to maybe to go as far as inclusive education. If you have so many children coming from different cultures, and there is a possibility there for inclusivity. And we have today, as the Peruvians, small, if you like, in scale, of course, but you can learn so much from it, and you can actually it can be done, not to use an old slogan, but it is important that countries in the region realize that it's not a it's not a burden. Migrants and migrant children, specifically refugees, displaced population, no, they are never a burden. It's an addition. It's you enrich yourself as as a society, and you need to have multicultural a multicultural context for this. And I think it is it is probably the opportunity. But that's my biggest. I see it as the largest contribution at the moment. Just to make it positive, but also there's lots of work to be done.
Thank you so much, Pilar. That's a very powerful message that you're concluding with, that migrant children, refugee children, they're not a burden. They can actually enrich us and enrich our cultures in many ways, and even economically. So I don't want to dilute what you've said. We will just end there. Thank you very much. I know I've struggled to pronounce your second name for many years now. I hope I finally succeeded.
Yes.
Dr. Pilar Aguilar was our guest today. And if you have any questions for her, please do write in the questions, and we shall pass them on to her for her response.
Please.
Thank you so much for taking this time and joining us from Geneva.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you.
Have you.
Thank you.